The Ardbeg Fermutation committee release. Is it worth $200? Let's find out. So welcome to another episode of Erik Wait Whiskey Studies, and if you don't already know, Ardbeg has a core range, and then they have these special bottlings that come out through the committee. Normally they have twice a year a committee release, one in around March and another one around Ardbeg Day at the end of May going into June, somewhere around there. But they do also have other special releases coming from the committee. They tend to be limited release. Generally, they tend to be higher ABV, and they tend to be very expensive, and Ardbeg fans really go for them. So there's a quick buy-up of them, and they just really hard to get. A lot of people really seek after them. The whiskeys overall tend to be a little more experimental, something a little bit different, and have a great story and a lot of course, marketing and advertising and imagery to go along with it. Generally speaking, the March and June releases tend to be a cask strength version and then a 46% ABV version. Those are, I would say, probably the main part of the committee releases, but sometimes they have other releases as well. For example, they had the Ardbeg release, which was a commemoration of the service of Mickey, the distillery manager, in his retirement. Then about a month later that same year, they had the normal annual committee release, and that last year was the Ardbeg Scorch. The higher ABV March release tends to have a tan color. And then later that year, around the end of May, going into June, they had the 46% alcohol release of Scorch. Typically, the labels have a black background. So you got a tan and you got a black one. You got a cask strength release, and then you have the 46% later on. So the Firmutation, released in February 2022, is not the two-parter version where you're going to have one at cask strength and then later another one at a smaller ABV, such as at 46% in end of May into June. This is a release that was produced because there was an oops at the distillery. But before I get into that, let me tell you a little bit about the whiskey. The Ardbeg Fermutation was fermented for 3 weeks. Normal is 72 hours due to a broken boiler. It was then aged for 13 years in ex-bourbon cask. It is non-chill filtered. It's bottled at 49.9% alcohol by volume. Sells for anywhere between $200 and $300 here in the United States, and I paid $229. So it doesn't say no added coloring, but if you look at it, it's fairly light, sort of a pale yellow. So I'm fairly certain there is no added coloring to it. One of the things I think they're trying to accentuate with this is the fact that there was an oops in the distillery, and they want that to be the main focus and experience from the whiskey. Basically what happened is the boiler broke down. They couldn't do the fermentation in a shorter time period. It ended up going for 3 weeks. The result is you're going to have more impact from the secondary characteristics from the production of the whiskey. What do I mean by that? Your primary characteristics of a whiskey come from the grain and the water. Your secondary characteristics come from the process of making the spirit. So that's everything that goes on in the fermentation, the mash, the wort, the distillation, and the cuts. The tertiary characteristics, or the third characteristics, come from aging, which is the time spent in the cask and what type of cask we use, and the climate and all that's related to the aging of the whiskey. So typically from an Ardbeg, most of your aromas and your flavors are coming from your primary and your tertiary. The primary characteristic that you're going to be getting from Ardbeg is going to be the peat character, the smoke and all that. That's due to obviously the barley being peated. So that's from the primary characteristic of the barley. And then the cask influence is going to be either second or even more so the influence on the whiskey. The production of the whiskey, typically from the fermentation, the shape of the stills and the cuts and all that, plays a role. But typically with Ardbeg, that's lesser than the primary and tertiary characteristics. But what makes this whiskey interesting is we're actually getting a much greater impact on the aromas and flavors from that secondary characteristic from the whiskey, which is coming from the fermentation. That is probably, from an academic side, my primary interest in this whiskey. Just interested, what is that going to do to the whiskey? So there's the academic curiosity side of the production of the whiskey, and then there is, hey, is the whiskey, just in terms of just drinking period, worth $200? So let's get into it. So when I first opened this, I gotta say I was sort of let down. I was very meh in terms of the whiskey, but remembering my own rule, don't judge a whiskey by neck pour, I decided, you know what? Withhold judgment and just keep trying it for several days until I get around to where I think it's really demonstrating what it's really all about. When I first had it, it was, yeah, there was smoke, there was some fruit, but there wasn't much going on. It wasn't really all that expressive or anything unique. And I thought, like, oh crud, this is just, a marketing story. This is just, the imagery and all that, selling the whiskey. A lot of hype, because a lot of hype does go into these committee releases, and people get all worked up about it, and everybody's searching for them and looking for them, which drives up the prices, which then people go out and buy as many as they can and then flip them and try to rip people off by selling for exorbitant prices. And so I thought, oh crap, Ardbeg's gone the way of a lot of other distilleries. However, when I came back to it on Monday, already it was showing, the second day I ended up getting into it, it was already showing some differences and some development. So, as I said before, this is much more expressive from the secondary characteristics. It has, I would say, the most pronounced maltiness of all the Ardbegs. And if you don't know what malt smells like, I don't know what else to liken it to. It's just very malty. Yes, the smoke and the peat is there, but in comparison to other Ardbegs, the smoke and the peat isn't as intense as a lot of other Ardbegs. Now it's there, and in comparison to non-peated whiskeys or some other whiskeys that only have or slightly peated, yeah, it's a lot more than that. But in comparison to Ardbeg 10 or Corryvreckan or Uigeadail, or NO or the core range, it has less peat than those. In fact, I would say of all committee releases that have come out, I would say this is the least peatiest of them all, and yet it's still making its presence known. On the nose, Ardbeg typically, if you've done it in a bourbon cask, typically has this lemon and lime profile. This, if there's any lime, it's barely there, but it's almost completely lemon, a lot of lemon. This is the most citrusy of all the Ardbegs I've ever tried, and I've got quite a bit of them. So it's a heavier lemon emphasis, it's a heavier malty emphasis, and it's got a lot more vanilla on the nose than I've ever experienced with any other Ardbeg. It's got a little bit of saltiness there, ocean sea breeze. It doesn't have the typical clay muddy character, the earthiness of an Ardbeg. The smoke characteristic is a little bit ashy, but not overly so. So it's sort of like a campfire that just went out. And it does have a slight floral note. On the palate, as on the nose, the malty character on this is much more intense than any other Ardbeg. That sort of cereal, grainy, malty character is much more pronounced. It's also very citrus forward, a lot of lemon, not so much of the lime. It does have some smoke and peat there, but it's moderate in comparison to other Ardbegs. It is sweet on the front, sweet in the middle, sweet into the finish. It's not an intense super sweetness, so it's not super sugary, but it's primarily sweet all the way through. Think of like a lemon drop. And it doesn't really dry out towards the back end, and there's just a little bit of saltiness on the back end. And as on the nose, there's a lot more vanilla than I would say any other Ardbeg that I've ever experienced. It doesn't have a great range of flavors. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of depth to the flavors. Generally, overall, it's a very good, very nice peated whiskey from Islay. It's tasty. However, there's nothing mind-blowing here just from a dram to enjoy. If you're looking for a whiskey just to enjoy, hey, this is really, really tasty, this tastes absolutely fantastic, this will blow your mind, that is not this whiskey. Ardbeg Dark Cove, probably the best committee release ever to come out of Ardbeg. That's a mind-blowing experience. If you can ever get another whiskey like that, that's one where you're going to definitely want to buy it again. And that's a bottle that's probably now selling for close to $1,000. This is just sort of an everyday good run-of-the-mill flavor profile. There's nothing mind-blowing here. But from an academic standpoint, from wanting to understand whiskey production, I find it interesting, fascinating to experience what a more lengthy fermentation does and how it intensifies the malty character there, and I don't know if this was due to the spirit bank or due to the fermentation, that some of the smoky character in comparison to a lot of the Ardbegs is not quite as intense. So it's a generally good whiskey. It's not a bad whiskey. It's tasty, it's interesting, but that's about it. What would I score it? I'd give it a solid 86 points out of 100. If this was a bottle that you could pick up for 60 bucks, I'd say, yeah, I'd go ahead and buy it, and it's widely available and easy to get and all that. But would I recommend buying this at 200 bucks? If you're just looking for a whiskey that you're just going to enjoy, 200 bucks, I would say hell no. I would rather spend 55, 60 bucks, depending on what your market is, on a 10-year-old from Ardbeg, an Ardbeg 10-year-old. I would much rather spend that much on an Ardbeg 10-year-old, or 80, 90 bucks, whatever the Corey Vreckens are going at, or the Ugadal is going at. Those are far superior whiskeys to this one. This one is only worth spending that kind of money if for an academic reason, right, to understand what a more lengthy fermentation does to a whiskey, and that's it. I bought one bottle of this. I've got it right about here right now. I've got about right there. I do not intend to buy another one. Most of the other committee releases, I tend to buy two, one to drink and then one to save for some other time. Particularly if I really like it. I also tend to buy the March releases, and then if there's a June release, I tend to buy that one as well and do a side-by-side comparison. This is just an expensive education at 200 bucks. I definitely, if you're seeing these for 300 bucks and up, I would say hell no. It's just not worth it. If you're just looking for a real tasty dram, I still recommend the Ardbeg 10-year-old. Still, even though it's gone up 5 to 10 bucks over the last couple of years, it's still one of the highest quality price ratios of, I think, any Scotch whiskey on the market. All right, that's it for this review. If you subscribe to this channel, I want to thank you very much for watching. If you've not yet subscribed, and ask that you subscribe and ring the bell to be notified for when I go live or post a new video. And until next time, cheers. Hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out these other whiskey videos.